Hello and welcome to a special episode of Fast Talkers as we whip around some of the best people from the paddock, but with a certain LGBTQ kind of theme to it, because we talk about diversity all the time, yet what are we really doing about it? Well, I wanted to do something proactive. So I thought I'd get a gaggle of my mates from various paddocks and we can have a little chat about what it's like representing. Obviously, I represent being a lady, but let's talk to some of the other people on our panel this week and find out what it's really like. So let's start off with Matt Bishop, who's Director of Communications at the W Series, and I'm going to call him an all-round PR guru, used to work in Formula One. I mean, Matt, you have many hats that you wear, but I suppose the one that we want to talk to you about is life in the F1 paddock for a guy who isn't a normal heterosexual, as they call it.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm 57 and I arrived in the Formula One paddock in the very early 90s as a journalist. And I was very definitely the only gay in the Formula One village then. Well, I probably wasn't, but I was the only one that let on, that was out. And, you know, now it is very different. There are quite a few, not that many more, but there are quite a few more gays in the Formula One village, if you like, mostly in the media and marketing and PR and so on and so forth. But even now in 2020, there are still mechanics, to my knowledge, who are hiding because they don't feel confident to come out as gay in the Formula One environment, which is a pity and needs to change. And that's why I am a founder ambassador of Racing Pride, which is another of my hats.
Many hats, as we said. Let me introduce the next guest we have, which is Charlie Martin, racing driver and LGBTQ campaigner. And Charlie, when it comes to racing drivers, there are hardly any who are open about either being transgender or their sexuality. So you are very open about it, and you are, as you say, an activist and campaigner. Was that a difficult thing to do?
I think it can be difficult in terms of making the decision to be open and to just be visible as your true self in both the race paddock and in the kind of general motorsport media. It's quite, I know when I got to the point when I came back to England, having raced in France for quite a long time, and I had no real profile over here, and it was a really difficult situation to weigh up that decision, because on the one hand, I felt like there was a huge opportunity to do good by educating people and being visible, but equally, like as any driver knows, it's tough out there. It's tough to make it in your career, to get the breaks, the opportunities, the backing, and to go and do something that very much goes against the grain of traditional motorsport. It is quite a scary thing to go out and do. It's a real leap of faith, and as you say, I think that's to some extent probably why there's only right now a handful of drivers who do publicly stand up and say, yeah, I'm gay, I'm transgender, I'm proud to be me, and that's just a part of who I am. Yeah.
Now, one person I know who, personally anyway, I don't think has ever had an issue with being who you are. Hazel Southwell, motorsport journalist, situated in a pub right now because it's the only place you could find because you've just given blood. But Hazel, tell me, how do you fit into the picture? We've had a couple of people who are very much campaigners and activists.
I think for me, like when I arrived in motorsport, I was already out. It didn't ever occur to me to hide it. I'm a journalist, so there is some extent, because I'm in Formula E, it's a little bit easier, but when I worked because generally we are a bit more progressive, or a lot more progressive a lot of the time. It's a much younger cohort, and also because people have to respect me by this point to some extent, so if I tell them to stop making horrible homophobic jokes, they kind of have to. I think where I fit into it is just sort of being visibly and kind of, I guess it's never occurred to me to sort of not be obnoxiously sort of out because it's how I'd always lived my life before, and it wasn't like I could go back in the closet or to erase that bit of me. And although I was quite aware that it was unusual in motorsport, there were plenty of things about me that were unusual in motorsport. So sort of, it was fairly far down the list of things. And I think also I would want to be out anyway, because I think there's a lot of situations where people won't say something homophobic or transphobic or like prejudice to your face if they know that you are whatever, and they probably won't have those discussions in front of you if they are aware of people around them. But if they're not, then bluntly, even the media make a lot of like pretty gross jokes. It gets very locker room, it gets like genuinely nasty. And the more people you have who publicly it's very visible that affects or hurts or whatever, it's like that. It's why, although actually it bears nothing to do with my job, there's no reason that my sexuality affects the way that I ask drivers questions in media, or whatever. That's more my height probably, but it's, to me, it would be important to be out in an environment where it is kind of hostile, partly because I'm just quite confrontational, and also because I would think about me in the closet previous, or like a different me who felt that she had to hide.
Matt, we'll start with you, but how accepted have you felt? Have you always felt accepted for who you are and for being gay in the world of Formula One?
Well, as I say, I arrived about, 25 years ago, when I was just in my very early 30s. So I wasn't even a very young man then. And I decided, look, I'm old enough and ugly enough, certainly ugly enough, to be a big boy about this and just be open. So from the very outset, when I arrived in Formula One, I didn't stroll up or march up to Bernie Ecclestone and say, by the way, Bernie, nice to meet you. I'm new in Formula One, I'm gay. No, I didn't do that. That would have been inappropriate and disconcerting, as indeed it would be today. But what I did do is, as I got to know people and as they got to know me and as they got to chit-chat, I would say, yes, I'm gay. And I found it liberating. And actually, there are a number of Formula One drivers who were driving back in the early 90s who have since told me that they found it liberating and even a learning curve and educative for them in that sense, because they hadn't actually knowingly, acceptingly met gay men at that time. Okay, they may have been served by a waiter that they thought might have been gay, but they had never got to know someone or worked with them. And some of them to this day are very good friends, my contemporaries, people my age who I got to encounter in the early 90s, who were racing in Formula One in the early 90s, and now, as we know each other so well after all this time, say, yeah, it was actually useful for me. It was good for me to meet you and understand that, of course, the main message being, this is a weird and wonderful world which we all inhabit together, and difference is something that we can all celebrate and cherish, even though in the world of Formula One, it is very white and very male and very middle class, etc., and very heterosexual. I had one driver give me a hard time, and I'd prefer not to reveal his name, simply because my message, I think all our message here is that we need to move forward to continue the work that needs to be done to assist acceptance of LGBTQIA+ people in sport, in motorsport, in the world. And as I say, amongst mechanics, it's still quite difficult. So I don't want to start a kind of tabloid witch hunt, but there was one driver who called me, perhaps I don't know if I'm allowed to say it, it's not a very rude word, but he called me a fat faggot. Now, I couldn't really disagree, because I was overweight and I was gay. So, you know, factually, I was on a hiding to nothing to contradict. But it was rude and offensive and unpleasant. And I don't think it would ever be said now. But he made a habit of calling me that. And actually, I don't think it did him any good at all. But didn't really do me any harm, because it kind of put me on the map and made people think, well, poor old Matt, having to be called that by that driver.
Charlie, have you ever been made to feel uncomfortable, awkward, or like you shouldn't be at an event?
I don't think I can really put my finger on specific times when that's happened. I think, to be honest, I think the hardest time that I went through was when I came out as transgender. And back then, when I was, you know, I was competing in hill climb in the UK. So it was club level, kind of grassroots motorsport. And that was really, really difficult. That was really tough going. I had to kind of grit my teeth and force my way through it, because there'd never been anybody like me in that kind of pool of people competing. And it was just a real, people just didn't know how to treat me. You know, there was this massive kind of awkwardness around, you know, just even trying to have a conversation with people. And you know, I think what happened, and this is true of so many people I know who had similar experiences, is that I think when people, I think being English, we're really guilty of this as well. You know, when we don't know what's the right thing to say, and we're scared of upsetting someone or saying the wrong thing, we just tend to kind of hang back and say nothing. And when you're on the receiving end of that, that comes across as passive aggressive behaviour. And so for a long time for me, going into the paddock in the early days of transition, when I felt awkward myself, I wasn't really comfortable about how I looked or anything. I just had to deal with that kind of sea of blank faces, where all these people that I used to know and joke with and laugh with were suddenly very, very distant and very standoffish. And it took probably a year, to be honest, to win people over and to just start up conversations with people whereby we got to a point where actually they didn't feel awkward, I didn't feel awkward, and we all just kind of got along and everything was fine. But I think that first year was, yeah, it was like wading through treacle at times. You know, it's hard going.
I mean, as both, you know, Matt and Charlie, you're campaigners, you're very much out there. But Hazel, is there more that us as journalists can and should be doing to try and, I don't know, to tell a story or to break down the barriers or to help with diversity in general in motorsport?
I think one of the things, and I've started saying this quite a lot this year, I guess because we've had like a weird break and people have been asking about this kind of thing. But one of the things is like challenging existing myths as journalists, which is something that we should do. It's an important part of a journalist's role. And to take on myths like sponsors would drop a driver from F1 if an F1 driver ever came out. No, they wouldn't. Can you imagine if Coca-Cola dropped a driver because they came out? Or like, you know, Kaspersky, or like any of the other gigantic brands that sponsor F1. Like, no, they couldn't. Like, the problem is a lot further back. But we also shouldn't sort of accept those kind of like strange myths, like, oh, it will never happen because of, and like these things can't happen because of, because it's like, there's an element of collusion to it when you simply accept things as status quo and you accept the sport as undiverse and as unchangeable in that respect, because it's not. It absolutely can change, and actually, like, you know, it's the 21st century. We're in 2020. The vast majority of people in most countries are quite accepting of LGBT people. There's various, unfortunately, very powerful lawmakers in a lot of countries who are not. But like, yeah, there's a sort of, I think as journalists, the important thing is to challenge it and to say, like, well, why hasn't there been whatever? Like, why aren't people comfortable living openly in paddocks? Like, why is this something that is considered sort of offbeat at this point when it should simply be the norm? Like, it shouldn't be something that you have to assume it isn't part of the default. And so, yeah, I think the journalist's role is to kind of ask, well, why isn't this normal thing normalised in this world? Like,
I actually think that Lewis Hamilton is a very significant person here, because obviously Lewis Hamilton is the only black in the Formula One village, and he's very, you know, as we know, and he attracts some criticism for it, but I'm a huge supporter, and of course I worked with Lewis for 5 years. But he champions end racism, and I think he's taken the sport with him and taken the other drivers with him. But I only tell this little story for an emblematic reason, because it shows that I think Lewis is very committed to all of this progressive thinking. I quite recently did a tweet where I talked about this whole issue, obviously to do with LGBTQ issues. Lewis retweeted it. Now, you know, that was nice, because it meant my tweet was read by 5.8 million people, which is a rarity. But also, I think it shows that Lewis Hamilton, who is first among equals in Formula One in so many ways, is also leading from the front, not just on the issue of race, but also on the issue of diversity and inclusion in general. And, you know, in many, many ways, I think when Lewis finally hangs up his helmet, he'll be missed much more than people realize. And one of the ways will be not only that we don't see him doing the brilliant things on track that we've all grown used to loving watching him do, but also that there won't be a leader in this area unless somebody else steps into the breach. And I wonder who it's going to be, because Lewis is the one at the moment, without any question, and we should be grateful for him.
It's very difficult as a journalist in Formula One personally, and you know, Matt and I have been in many a paddock together. I mean, this is a very stuffy traditionalist paddock where even if you look at the media contingent, it is mostly older, white, probably upper middle class men writing about a sport that they are incredibly passionate about, but couldn't probably look outside of the little box that F1 tends to live in. And I just wonder, Charlie, how many people have reached out to you to try and understand your story, what you've gone through, and how important is it that, you know, the bigger newspapers, the people who are covering the likes of Formula One, actually reach out beyond Formula One?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I mean, I've had articles in The Guardian and The Telegraph, which have been you know, great opportunities to reach a mass audience, and like you say, reach outside that bubble of Formula One. And I think that's one of the critical things, is that, you know, there are so many stories out there that just don't get heard, that don't get the light of day. And unless you're really within that motorsport sort of sphere of activity, you know, these things just go over your head. And I think, I mean, that's one of the reasons I've been very lucky to have the level of exposure that my story's generated, but also why I've been very motivated to talk about it. I mean, one of the bits of criticism that I come up against, the one thing that I get the most regularly are comments like, why are you talking about being transgender? You know, why does this matter? I don't care who you like. If you're fast, you're fast, and you know, that's all that matters. And it's all very well saying that when that's coming from somebody who's perhaps, you know, whether it's been in their sport or their career or whatever in their life, the people that they've looked up to, the people that have inspired them, the positions they've wanted to reach in their organization have always been inhabited by people who looked like them and who they could relate to and identify with. But when you don't have those same experiences in your life, it's so important that I think we have that kind of representation. It's so critical, because, you know, when I was a kid, I never saw any, you know, I never had any like heroes or real role models that I could look up to and think, yeah, you know, there's a transgender fighter pilot or racing driver or whatever. It's and I think that's why it's so important that the people who are willing to be visible, who are out there and, you know, sticking their head above the parapet, that their stories are given the light of day and presented in a really positive way. And also not just, you know, one thing I've been really conscious is of the fact that I don't just want to be badged as transgender racing driver Charlie Martin. It's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it's a badge that, you know, I'm proud to be who I am, and I'm here doing what I'm doing at a time when, yeah, you know, being transgender, doing what I'm doing puts me in a very unique space. But equally, it's not the single thing that defines me. It's shaped me into the person that I am, and I'm proud to be me, but I don't want to be defined as just transgender. And I'm sure that goes the same for anyone who identifies as LGBTQ+. It's, you know, it's just one element of who we are and our identities.
Hazel, here's a question for you. So there are a whole host of female sports people who are comfortable to be out and proud and part of the LGBT community. But sportsmen, not so many. In fact, it's very, very rare. As part of that community, can you try and understand or work out why that is?
I think, unfortunately, and this is going to play on some stereotypes, but I think they are the ones that are what affects this to some extent. I think partly queer women are regarded as less of a threat to the majority of people in a paddock. There's not really like the same kind of like gay panic about working with a queer woman a lot of the time, partly because it's an incredibly male-dominated world. So the revelation that somebody fancies women, even if they are also another woman, actually kind of makes you almost fit in a little bit more, if anything else. So, and there's a sort of strange tendency to count LGBT or bisexual and lesbian women as like basically like one of the boys to some extent. Some of the time, and it's sort of like, well, whatever. And then I think there's a much generally more hostile environment towards bisexual, pansexual gay men. I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of it's just outright stupidity about it, bluntly. There's a lot of like locker room silliness, and there's a huge number of stereotypes that, because, you know, when you look at who can be a Formula One driver, for instance, and Formula One's the biggest one, so, you know, it tends to lead on other fields. But, you know, people panic because one of them, or where they were genuinely angry at Charles Leclerc for wearing a banana suit, because that was simply like too silly for an F1 driver. Like, you can't deviate from this like very, very set kind of super masculine, super like you have to do these things, and it's like almost a James Hunt tick box, but you've got to embody this particular fantasy, and the drivers that don't, and there's more and more of them at the minute, get a lot of stick for it, for things that are like just normal things, but they don't happen to fit this incredibly narrow view of what they should be, and certainly nowhere in the idea of what they should be is gay. You get nasty comments about it, fans do as well, and like there's a lot of outright hostility to it. I also think that women in the sport generally, we are a little bit more marginalised, so there probably is overall a sort of safety and obscurity a lot of the time, which is a separate issue in itself. But I think that the reason there's generally more out women and have historically been more out women is just on the list of issues. It's like the first thing people see is that you're a woman, and that's enough of a kind of like, whoa, that by the time they're getting into the detail, like.
I accept everything you say, actually, but I also do think it's ready to change. I think some of the reluctance among male gay sports stars to be open is imagined, is a kind of vestigial, they're all against me, I won't be accepted type of attitude. And let's look at when, I'll give two famous examples, Gareth Thomas, the rugby player, and Tom Daley, the diver. Now, they both came out rather gently and reluctantly. If you remember Tom Daley's YouTube video, it was all slightly apologetic, and I think I might be bi, and I've got a lover at the moment who happens not to be female, that kind of thing. Both of them fantastically well received, unbelievably well received, not a syllable against them other than from genuine nutters on the social media, but really any commentator of any note positive. And I think that is something that Formula One would now be ready for. I don't know if any of the current Formula One drivers are gay. I assume they aren't. We must have had some in the closet over the years. We must have, because there's been nearly 1,000 of them. You know, and only one ever came out, which was Mike Beutler in the early 70s, who very sadly died of AIDS in 1988. And even then he was only half out, only to friends. But I think if somebody came out now, and this applies absolutely to the English Premier League as well, if somebody came out now and was confident and articulate about it and said, I am a gay man, and this is my boyfriend, and I want everybody to understand that, to accept it, and I want young gay people, whether they are LGBTQIA+, of whatever age, to look up as a role model to me as a Formula One driver, or me as an English Premier League footballer, and I'm there for you. Are you disagreeing with me? I think they would be enormously well received, don't you?
I completely agree, Matt. I think now, like the thing I said about like Coca-Cola can't drop a driver for being gay. The fears that are generally put around and that circulate about why this couldn't happen are, I think, pretty fictional to some extent. I think, you know, there are all kinds of things that get drivers marginalised, and I'm not saying that it would be a particularly easy time for them. And definitely, you know, turn off your notifications on social media, but I assume most of them already have. I honestly, yeah, I think the sport is ready, and I totally agree with you. I think it will be something that comes as a shock to a lot of people, but, you know, there is no way in which somebody could continue to hold a post in a global sport like that and be actively opposing the idea of an out driver. And I think it would be enormously healthy and good for the sport. You know, which isn't to say like one of them has to, or like, you know, whatever.
Well,
but
there may not be one. There may not be, of course, currently one. But, you know, time was when a tabloid newspaper might get on such a person's case in a negative way. Now, their sports editor would be saying, "Get me a 1-to-1. I need a 1-to-1 with this new guy who's just come out." And that driver would become more famous, richer, because they would have more personal endorsements via sponsorship, and would probably be harder to sack. The world is waiting. I don't know which of them is, perhaps none of them, but whichever Formula One driver next walks into the paddock that genuinely is gay, come out for your own selfish career reasons, mate.
Charlie, what word of, I suppose, advice would you give to anyone watching this who is on board with the, you know, we are one, greater diversity? How do we help and better ourselves?
I think that one of the most important things is support from allies, because I think one thing that we generally see is that a lot of the proactive sort of campaigning, you know, for the LGBTQ community in sport especially comes from people coming out, and what really can help facilitate that is creating that supportive environment where people know that they can see without any doubt that if they come out, they feel like, yeah, the support is there. Like you have Rainbow Laces in football in the Premier League, massively successful campaign, because it's about everybody coming together and just doing something very symbolic, very visible, and showing that, yeah, you know, of course we support LGBTQ people. And so I think really it's about people who are allies, really coming together in sort of coordinated ways to make simple gestures that just create that environment for people.
I think it's about people vocally expressing that they are allies. You know, if the paddock or the many paddocks reinforce that it is okay to be there and it is okay to be LGBTQ, you will have a situation eventually where if people feel uncomfortable with people being okay with it, they will be the ones who are marginalised, and where there's a much more supportive environment. So it is things like, you know, as a journalist, it's stuff like not assuming the drivers are straight, or like not assuming they're anything else, but like just not making assumptions, or like generally covering LGBT stories and making sure that, you know, regardless of your own orientation, that you are vocally supportive of things, because it's the right thing to do. Like it's
being on the right side of history. Hey, Hazel.
Yeah.
Language is quite important here, but I don't want to get hung up on language. I think sometimes people worry so much about language that they don't really worry about content. I'll give you an example, a story that I was told the other day by a mechanic who works in a current Formula One team. He told me the story not long ago, but it referred back to a Christmas party that his department was having. And the head of the department was saying, shall we have wives and girlfriends? Shall we invite wives and girlfriends or not? And okay, that's language, but of course it is immediately exclusive for him because he happened to be a gay man. And I suppose the message going forward there would be, if they can find it in themselves to find the habit to say, shall we have partners? Or shall we have, even better, shall we have wives, girlfriends, husbands, or boyfriends? If you actually say that, you've liberated the person to be able to say it, because the result of the invitation being, shall we have wives and girlfriends, is that the person I'm talking about attended the Christmas party alone with his male partner, sitting at home watching Antiques Roadshow or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so right. And it makes so much sense, but it's not often something that people necessarily think about. So Matt, just very quickly, because Charlie's got to go off and do qualifying, please share with us your book and tell us a little bit about it.
Thank you, Jenny, so much for giving me the opportunity to do such a shameless plug. Well, it is relevant, however. So I'm going to show you, there it is. The Boy Made the Difference is what it's called. It was published on the 28th of August, so it is hot off the press. All proceeds go to charity. My mother, who was a novelist, died in 2013, and when she died, I set up a charitable appeal called the Bernardine Bishop Appeal, which fundraises for Crick Sargent, which is a wonderful charity which helps children and young people and their families when those children and young people are affected by cancer, sometimes affected obviously in the most terrible way one can imagine. What could be worse than that? So what a wonderful charity it is. And every penny will go to that. What's it about? Well, you know, I'm 57. My husband, Angel, is 31. And I suppose when I got to know him and love him and got to know and love his friends, who were more his age than mine, I began to realize that actually gay men of that age didn't realize what life was like for gay men of my age when we were their age. And it was like the First World War. That's what it was like. Because in the late 80s and early 90s, HIV/AIDS was a killer on the most extraordinary scale. still is in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, and in areas where it is not possible to either afford or have available the antiretroviral drugs that now control it and make it not a killer in the Western world, it is still a killer. But 32 million people have been killed by AIDS in the history of this planet, and 38 million people still live with HIV. Now, my novel is now going to immediately sound like an extraordinarily miserable and maudlin book, but it isn't. What it is a story set against that narrative backdrop in London in the late 80s and early 90s, but it's a nuclear family, mum, dad, son, and 3 other key characters and various other sundry ones, trying their best to live their life, as we should all, against that very difficult narrative backdrop. And it is sad at times, but, well, if I may use the name Natalie Pinkham, who is another Formula One presenter, but on a rival channel, I do apologize, Jenny, but she told me that it made her gasp, laugh, and cry. Well, if I can make readers gasp, laugh, and cry for charity, that'll do me.
I really enjoyed it. I thought it was incredibly well written. So.
Well, that's really sweet of you. That's very, very kind of you indeed, Hazel. Thank you.
I've not read it yet, but I'm definitely going to read it. So just to be totally upfront. It sounds really good, Matt.
But you can get it on Amazon, I'm assuming?
You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on the Troubadour website because it's published by Troubadour. You can get it on Book Depository. You can order it in all good bookshops. It's available in paperback and Kindle.
Amazing. Matt, we're totally run out of time. Otherwise, Charlie is going to qualify stone cold last. And we don't want that to happen. But thank you for your time from all of you, for sharing your experiences and some of your advice moving forward. And all I can say is that I hope that anyone watching this has been able to understand a little bit more, been able to enjoy it, understand and educate themselves, and moving forward, let's all hope for a little bit more diversity in our motorsporting paddocks.
100% agree.
Sounds good to me.
So from us, it's bye-bye and thank you.